Hi, I'm John and welcome to the channel. In this video I'm going to take a look at 4 micro four thirds zoom lenses across a variety of prices and see how they compare at overlapping focal lengths. I recently bought the Panasonic Leica 50-200mm primarily for action photography and video, skiing and mountain biking with my family. I wanted as much reach as I could get in a smallish form factor with a bright maximum aperture and good image quality, all with good weather sealing. So far I'm pretty happy with the lens and the image quality is pretty nice. The build quality of the 50-200 is much better than I had perceived from pictures I had seen of the lens. Also, the optical image stabilization in the lens is effective, though I do need to play with the lens settings and the IBIS on my EM1 Mark III to determine what gives the best stabilization for stills and video. My motivation for shooting this video was to see how much sharper the Panasonic Leica was than the cheaper Telephoto zooms I have collected over the years, to see if it was worth the expense and the extra effort lugging the noticeably larger lens around when out skiing or biking with the family. I've bought and sold a bunch of lenses over the 12 years I've been shooting micro four thirds. I kept the Olympus 40-150 f4-5.6 and the Panasonic 45-150 4-5.6, as I wouldn't get much for them if I were to sell them. I also kept the Panasonic 14-140 Mark II, which is a remarkable lens given the range and size, although I probably wouldn't miss it much if I sold it, as I tend to shoot telephoto rather than wide. And as we will see in this comparison, it is understandably the worst performer at 140mm. And while it has less reach than the other lenses, only it and the Panasonic Leica have any form of weather sealing. In this group, the Olympus is the only lens not to feature image stabilization, while the Panasonic 45-150 has the lower rated Mega OIS rather than the Power OIS of the other two lenses. I've also used the Olympus 40-150 f2.8 extensively, but I sold it about a year ago when I reshuffled my camera gear. The f2.8 is a great lens, but it was ultimately replaced with the Panasonic Leica 50-200, as that lens is substantially smaller while having longer reach and very effective optical image stabilization. The loss of a stop of aperture at the long end seems a reasonable trade-off. Okay, so rather than shoot test charts, let's get into testing the lenses in a real-world setting. I packed up my EM1 Mark III and the lenses in my Peak Design 10-litre sling bag, along with the Ulanzi travel tripod, and headed over to Central Park to shoot pictures of the El Dorado building across the Jackie-O Reservoir. I shot a handful of pictures with each lens and focal length combination, supported on a tripod, and shows the sharpest image from the sample taken. So now let's compare a couple of lenses side by side, and we'll eliminate the losers as we go. Based on my recollection of how the lenses performed, I started with what I thought were the worst two performers at the long end, pitting the Panasonic 14-142 on the left against the Olympus 40-150 on the right. At the lowest common focal length of 40mm, it's a pretty close call when we zoom in. I'm struggling to call a winner here, though the Olympus may have a touch more contrast. Moving up to a focal length of roughly 50mm, I feel the Olympus is slightly sharper than the Panasonic, but it's still very close. So let's take a look at 100mm. At this focal length, the Olympus is starting to show its abilities and is clearly sharper than the 14-140. But the Panasonic is performing pretty well given its zoom range. So now let's end this comparison at 140mm. Here you can clearly see that the Olympus retains its superiority over the Panasonic. But again, the Panasonic has done a great job for a 10x zoom. Fine details can be made out with both lenses, but ultimately the Olympus is that bit sharper. So evaluating the Panasonic 14-140 against the Olympus 40-150 consumer lens, it's a pretty easy shakeout. If you want greater sharpness at the long end of the zoom range, then clearly get the Olympus. Cost aside, if you value some weather sealing, image stabilization and better build quality in a compact package with the ability to zoom out to 14mm, then go with the Panasonic. You don't get quite the sharpness that you get in the Olympus at the long end, but it won't be a deal breaker for most. So now let's compare the Olympus 40-150 to what is its direct competitor, the Panasonic 45-150 f4-5.6. The Olympus is on the left with the Panasonic on the right. So while the Olympus goes to 40mm at the wide end and the Panasonic to 45mm, I totally forgot to take samples of the Olympus at 45mm. So let's move on to 50mm, which ain't so different. At 50mm, the Olympus looks sharper to my eye, though note I had erroneously stopped the Olympus down to f5.6, whereas the Pani was at f4.5, which may have helped the Olympus out here. So let's take a look at the lenses at 100mm with both lenses at 5.6. In this comparison, I'm seeing very little difference between the lenses. Overall, the Olympus looks more contrasty and a little bit warmer, but the Panasonic shows fractionally more detail in certain features on the building. A difficult call for sure. And now moving up to 150mm. This is pretty much the same story as at 100mm, though maybe the Olympus eclipses the Pani by a whisker. These lenses are so close at this focal length that I wouldn't argue with you if you called it the other way. Okay, so let's summarise how these lenses stack up against each other. Both lenses are showing a very good amount of detail, though I think the Olympus appears fractionally sharper, though I think this is within the margin of error of my test. With the Pani you get some optical image stabilisation and nicer build quality for a similar price. The Olympus feels noticeably cheap in the hands, though its performance belies its cost. Plus, you get an extra 5mm at the wider end of the zoom range. If you're on a budget, you can't really go wrong with either of these lenses. Okay, so now let's do a comparison between the cheapest lens in this test and the most expensive lens. We're going to pit the Pani Leica 50 to 200mm against our reigning champ, the Olympus 40 to 150. Let's see if the extra money buys us extra resolution in a real-world comparison. The Pani Leica images are on the left with the Olympus on the right. Let's start the comparison at 50mm. You may recall that I mistakenly set the Olympus to f5.6 at this focal length, rather than its maximum aperture, which is much closer to f4. With the Panasonic wide open and the Olympus at f5.6, it's pretty difficult to draw out a winner. If we stay at the same focal length and stop down the Panasonic, will that worry the Olympus? So staying at 50mm and bumping the aperture on the Panasonic from f2.8 to f4, we can see that the image improves slightly, and now I think it shades the Olympus, though the difference is pretty subtle. So let's move on up to 100mm. In my testing with the Panasonic wide open at f3.6 versus the Olympus at f5.6, the lens that often retails for 1/10 of the price is clearly the sharper lens. Let's give the Pani Leica a second chance here and close the aperture down to f4. Stopping down at f4, the Pani Leica is sharpened up considerably, though to my eye, the Ollie still edges the Panasonic. And on to 150mm wide open. The Panasonic is now sharper than the Olympus by a moderate amount. The Olympus is doing a really solid job, but the Pani gets its nose back in front. Given these somewhat surprising findings, let's take a moment and compare images of the Panasonic wide open side by side with itself stopped down at a range of focal lengths. Here we're at 50mm, with f2.8 on the left and f4 on the right. I'm seeing the f4 as marginally sharper, but it's not a particularly dramatic difference. And here we're at 100mm, with f3.6 on the left and f4 on the right. f3.6 is obviously softer than f4. Given the modest change in aperture, the difference is surprisingly significant. I've repeated similar tests 2 other times with the same results. While this is notionally disappointing, in reality, if you're not pixel peeping, this type of difference is rarely obvious. Besides, stopping down from f3.6 to f4 is barely noticeable in terms of exposure or depth of field. So in real-world use, it's effectively a non-issue, but it is a strange anomaly nonetheless. So now let's take a look at 150mm, with f3.9 on the left versus f5. Here the difference between f3.9 and f5 is very fine. So looking at the Pani Leica at 200mm, when we compare it side by side f4 to f5.6, I think the image at f4 is a little sharper, though the difference is subtle. Okay, so what are my thoughts after going through this whole process? The test proved that cheap mid-range telephoto zooms do a great job of resolving detail in real-world situations. The Olympus is visually flimsy, and I don't think either it or the Panasonic 45 to 150 would take much of a knock out on the hill. But overall, for the money, you get remarkable image quality. The Panasonic 14-140 is a highly versatile compact lens, and I think that the price is fair for what you get. Power, OIS, and decent weather sealing round out the package. And as for the Panasonic Leica 50-200, I think on balance I probably got a slightly soft version of the lens, but in reality I don't think that's going to make much if any difference to my photography. The main issue at 100mm seems to be eliminated by marginally stopping down the lens to f4. Maybe my copy is slightly softer than some of the reviews I've seen online. Perhaps those tests were performed with subjects closer than mine. The subject I was shooting was about 600 meters away, which may alter the performance of the lens. But by no means is my version of the lens soft, even in worst performing settings. In practice, I don't think my findings invalidate my use case for the lens. It is much better built and has significantly more reach than the other lenses. Plus, I feel much happier taking the Panasonic Leica out on the hill in changeable weather compared to any of the other lenses in the test. Plus, I get an extra stop of light throughout the zoom range, which can help keep the ISO down when jacking up shutter speeds in order to freeze moving subjects. So there it is. What are your thoughts on the lenses featured in this video? And do you have any similar observations with the Panasonic Leica 50-200 wide open at 100mm? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Also, be sure to let me know if you've observed any flaws in my testing that would help in future videos. Please comment down below and be sure to like and subscribe.